So here we are. Let's start with the second session with sex contribution, sex speech, and let's welcome Enrico Benelli to speak about Rhaeti and Etruscans, the Etruscological perspective. Please.
I need to share my screen, I suppose.
I think you are already. Yeah, yes, you can share your screen.
Can you see the slides?
Yes, very well, Enrico.
Well,
please.
I can start.
You have to press presentation anyway. Sorry.
So here. No, it doesn't work.
No, the small video on the right, close to the. Okay, that's fine.
Okay,
that's fine.
Perfect.
Well, so Simona asked me what the Rhaeti look like from an Etruscological perspective. Well, looking from the Etruscan world, the Rhaetian culture is something completely different. Everything is different. Burial customs are different. The cultural environment of everyday life is different. The pottery assemblages belonging to the archaeological fasces associated with the Rhaeti have no similarities with Etruscan pottery, not even in a single shape. The same is true for the best part of personal ornaments, and the ways in which the Rhaeti communicated with their deities have no parallels in the Etruscan world. These radical differences cannot be simplistically explained as a result of centuries of diverging historical trajectories in different environmental conditions and in more or less favorable positions inside the cultural networks linking the European landmass and the Mediterranean Sea. Cultural dialogue with the Greek world and with the Levantine world, for instance, was by sure extremely important in the development of the Etruscan culture, but it was not the primary factor which made the Etruscans Etruscans, and it was not the lack of it that made the Rhaeti so different from the Etruscans. From the archaeological point of view, the Rhaeti were not the Etruscans of the mountains. They were an entirely different culture. Let's think to the burial customs, for example. From the early Iron Age, in the Etruscan cultural area, the sets of grave goods show a concern with display of status that seems completely absent from the Rhaetian ones. These diverging attitudes persisted for many centuries. Grave assemblages in the Rhaetian world are formed almost exclusively by personal ornaments, usually burned together with the body. In the Etruscan world, on the contrary, the most important component of the grave assemblages was a set of implements for banqueting, consisting especially of ceramic and bronze vases, dozens of them, but sometimes even hundreds of them. Even the poorer Etruscan tombs usually included at least some vases, always referred to banqueting practice. All this shows that the burial practices of the Rhaetian world and the social and cultural meaning of grave goods were very different from what they were in the Etruscan world. Other elements like tomb architecture, rituals connected with the deposition, and so on could be added to this picture. Many kinds of Etruscan objects, kinds of objects of Etruscan provenance reached the Rhaetian territory, starting at least from the early Iron Age, but especially in later centuries after what seems to have been an interruption of communications between the two areas, especially in the 7th and early 6th centuries BC. from the late 6th century onwards, a great number of Etruscan artifacts moved northwards towards the Alpine passes and far beyond. This trade route continued to work until the collapse of the Etruscan cities north of the Apennines in the first half of the 4th century, and in some way it continued to work even later, albeit in a very different political and cultural framework. Archaeologists disagree about the importance of this remarkable flow of Etruscan goods reaching the Rhaetian territory from the late Archaic period onwards. Some think that the Rhaetian culture was profoundly affected by the circulation of these artifacts, or in other words, that a relatively widespread circulation of Etruscan goods in the Rhaetian territory is to be interpreted as evidence for a more profound cultural interplay. From this point of view, some changes that become apparent in late Archaic Rhaetian culture, like, for example, the diffusion of vine growing, the deposition of bronze statuettes in sacred places, or the appearance of a very basic planning in some major settlements, are supposed to be the result of the adoption of Etruscan cultural elements. On the other hand, others prefer to downplay the cultural significance of the circulation of Etruscan goods in Rhaetian territory, emphasizing that the regions inhabited by the Rhaeti were only a small part of a wider network of trade and exchange which linked the Etruscan world to Central Europe, and that the ultimate target of these trade routes laid well beyond the Rhaetian territory, which was involved only because it stood in the way between the major partners. From this point of view, the cultural changes which affected the Rhaetian world in the late Archaic period were not necessarily inspired by specifically Etruscan models. The planning of settlements may have been no more than a functional answer to their growing sizes. The introduction of vine growing, as well as the use of bronze statuettes as votive offerings, may have originated from anywhere south of the Alps. Taking sides of this discussion is not relevant here. The changes in late Archaic Rhaetian culture, whether or not they were the result of the adoption of Etruscan ideas and models, took place in a framework that remained alien to the Etruscan culture. In the late Archaic period, the Rhaeti did not become culturally Etruscan or more Etruscan. Both cultures continued to be distinguished from each other by wide and structural differences, as they had been before. I will focus here on a single aspect of Rhaetian culture, which is relatively well known, namely religious practices. Excavations have contributed to define a peculiar way of making offerings to the gods in open-air sacred areas, characterized by a sequence of large fires. This practice is not exclusive to the Rhaeti. It is widely attested in the Alpine region. The places where votive fires were lighted have received a technical definition in German language literature, Brandopferplätze, so places for sacrifice through burning. Incidentally, it is in these sanctuaries that most Etruscan imports have been found, while elsewhere, so outside the Rhaetian territory, they were mostly deposited in elite tombs. Nothing similar is known in the whole of the Etruscan world. Open-air sanctuaries did exist, of course. The Etruscan religious practice was not limited to large temples alone, but the Etruscan open-air sanctuaries seem to have always comprised a number of small or very small buildings, altars, pedestals, enclosures, and so on. features that had never been identified in Rhaetian sacred areas, with structures to quite other forms, like, for instance, platforms on which the offerings were burned. Moreover, burning is not common in Etruscan sanctuaries, and it appears only on a very small scale. In open-air sanctuaries, the offerings, including the animal and vegetal ones, were usually simply buried in pits. An extremely peculiar class of votive artifacts, the human figurines cut in bronze sheet, can show the complexity of cultural relationships entertained by the Rhaeti with their neighbors. Rhaetian figurines reproduce human beings in two different ways, either frontally or in profile. The latter type has no clear parallel anywhere in Italy. It is possible that it was inspired by a very uncommon type of Venetic bronze figurines. The former, on the contrary, has been recognized as a result of some kind of Etruscan influence, because 4 figurines of this kind have been found in the Etruscan settlement of Forcello di Bagnolo San Vito, whose role in the trade of Etruscan artifacts towards the Rhaetian territory is widely acknowledged. But no other Etruscan site has never revealed figurines of this type. Only one of them has been found in the sanctuary of Portonaccio at Veii, where it has been recognized as a distinctively non-Etruscan dedication, probably left by someone from the opposite bank of the Tiber, because this kind of figurines is extremely common in all non-Etruscan central Italy, from Latium to Umbria to the Pisan. It is highly likely that the people who left these figurines as offerings at Forcello were not Etruscans, and that their choice of a distinctively non-Etruscan type of votive artifact was intended to mark their cultural identity. We don't know why the Rhaeti began to produce human figurines cut in bronze sheet, and whence they took their inspiration to do so. In any case, they reveal the existence of a network of relationships that extended well beyond the Etruscan world. All this shows that the Rhaetian religious practices were radically different from the Etruscan ones. Even Etruscan artifacts in Rhaetian sanctuaries were employed in ways that were very different from Etruscan ritual practices. Since religion was an unmistakable mark of cultural and political identity, it is hard to overestimate the significance of this evidence. It seems to suggest that Rhaeti and Etruscans in the first millennium BC behaved as completely different peoples. The archaeological record shows no sign of any attempt to deliberately stress some kind of relationship between them, notwithstanding the clear similarity between their languages, which was evident even to outsiders like the Romans. Sanctuaries were also home of the largest number of Rhaetian inscriptions. Birth and development of an epigraphic culture in the Rhaetian world seems to have been closely connected with cult practices, like in ancient Venetia, for example, while in the Etruscan world, epigraphy was first introduced to record the ceremonial gift exchange between high-status individuals. Etruscan votive inscriptions appeared only much later. Therefore, it is no surprise that the structure of Rhaetian votive inscriptions is completely different from that of their Etruscan counterparts. Even if we are still not able to translate Rhaetic completely, and in votive inscriptions it may even be difficult to discern which names belong to deities and which to humans, the syntactic structure of the sentences is often relatively clear. What is striking in Rhaetian votive inscriptions is the relative frequency of names inflected in the pertinative case. This grammatical case is virtually unknown in Etruscan votive inscriptions. This means that the structure of Rhaetian votive inscriptions owed nothing to Etruscan models, notwithstanding the obvious proximity between the two languages. I strongly suspect that the Rhaetian votive inscriptions were mostly inspired by Venetic models, which needed to be modified, of course, because the Venetic language was very different from the Rhaetian one. Unfortunately, the severe limits in our knowledge of Rhaetic do not allow to go further than mere guesswork. Well, what are the conclusions to be drawn from this very quick overview? My idea as an Etruscologist is that it is highly likely that, looking from the Etruscan world in the first millennium BC, the Rhaetian culture appeared as an entirely alien culture. So, thank you.
Well, that's a very precise statement. Perhaps that's caused by the depth of the time in from which the two branches of Etruscan and Rhaetian have happened. Well, let's discuss this later. Thank you very much, Enrico. And the next, flash questions, please. Sorry.
Well, if I may, again, I just to have a short question. Well, that's true that we don't have Brandopher-Pletz in the Apennines, and we don't have it in the Etruscan context. But in the final Bronze Age, there are some peak dedications that are particularly frequent. For instance, in the late Bronze Age of the Terramara Apennine, the finding of a sword in the Alpe di Santa Giulia, and of a burnt layer, which is not a Brandopfer-Platz, but may have involved in the ritual some burnt activities, and the strange concentration of bronzes in the Gubbio Montengino site, that Montengino and Monteasciano as well, so that have made somebody, I think Andrea Cardarelli, suppose that there are between the recent Bronze Age and the final Bronze Age, that it is 13th century BCE and 10th century BCE, some peculiar concentrations of summit sanctuaries also in the Apennine, which is not exactly the same. They are not burning, but they are in a specific location which is connected closely to the sky, obviously. And so this could make only some idea, but for a limited period of time.
Yes, I concentrated essentially on the first millennium, of course. In the second millennium, something, of course, was different. But I started from a moment when the two areas took divergent trajectories. So from the beginnings of the first millennium, or maybe from the last century, from final Bronze Age, from the last centuries of the second millennium, I'm not entirely sure when this divide can be dated, but I've not done earlier. So the earlier word is completely different. So Cardarelli has even suggested that the Terramare culture, in the Terramare culture may be found the common ancestors of both the Rhaetian and the Etruscan culture of the historical times. I'm no specialist of this period, so I take this only as a paper by Cardarelli, I cannot comment this.
Well, this is, thank you. This is obviously problematic and another issue, and obviously one would have to discuss a lot. I only wanted to remark that the point is very strong that you made for the division, the total division between Etruscan word and Rhaetian word, even if the languages are related in such a late period. but maybe there can be some more connection in an earlier period. This is the point only, but I perfectly
discussion in the afternoon.
Thank you.
So,
sorry.
Okay, thank you. And let's move to the next speech of Ivo Heiner, the Tyrsenic question, why a quick solution is unlikely. Please.
All right, can you see my slides?
Yes, of course, yes.
All right. Dear colleagues, in that case, thank you very much for inviting me to today's round table. My talk is mostly about the methods by which we answer the Tyrsenic question. That is the question of whether the Tyrsenians were of autochthonous origin or were immigrants. A definitive answer to this question has, as you know, not yet been given. One reason for this has been described by my colleague Christoph Ulf from Innsbruck as follows, and I cite Ulf. An important reason for this is that the opinions held in modern scholarship are also closely linked to the ideological environments in which they are set. Now, today I will take Ulf's concern seriously and I will examine some linguistic data, the Tyrsenic nominal system. Following Ulf, I will do that without ideological prejudice founded on ancient tradition. And based on the showcase, I will argue that the Tyrsenic question can only be answered actually with a non-liquid, that means no answer possible from today's linguistic point of view. Before I go into Tyrsenic nominal system, let me send out a preliminary remark. Following Simona Marchesini, I assume the following relative chronology of the Tyrsenic language family. Rhaetic represents an older state of language than Etruscan, Lemnian a younger one. There are a lot of facts which can be taken for this chronology. Simona Marchesini, in her introductory remarks, mentioned a couple of them. Just let me stress one point. Rhaetic does not show any signs of language contact with Italic languages. Therefore, it's separated from Etruscan at a relatively early time when Etruscan was not yet in close linguistic contact with Italic languages. Unlike Rhaetic, Lemnian shows traces of linguistic contact with Italic. It also shows some shared archaism, and it also produced some innovation, but Lemnian seems to have split off from Etruscan, developing a certain independence of its own at a later time. Now, that's the reason for this relative chronology. Now, let me switch to the essential part of my presentation. As shown, our analysis leads us to a relative clear chronology. But what is the contribution of linguistic reconstruction when it comes to the question of the origin of the Tyrsenic language family? The following slides show that comparative reconstruction leads to a clear picture of the Proto-Tyrsenic nominal inflection. This slide depicts the singular situation. Details do not matter for our purposes now. Rather, the column of the side in red shows that we have a relatively accurate idea of the Proto-Tyrsenic case paradigm. The same holds for the plural inflection in the following slide. I show these two tables merely to document the process of comparative reconstruction. I have listed the reconstructed forms again on the following slide. As you see, Proto-Tyrsenic has two genitive classes, 1 versus 2. However, the differentiation seems to have taken place relatively late, since the rules of the distribution differ in the individual languages. Tyrsenic, and this is more important for our purpose, also has two plural class types, 1 and 2. They differ, at least according to Etruscan, as follows. Ra stands with animate nouns, qua with inanimate nouns. And I think Ignacio Diego also confirmed that a couple of years ago. An essential characteristic of the Tyrsenic languages is the agglutinative nominal inflection. The plural endings result from adding the case ending to the stem, extended by a plural marker, ra or qua. The grammatical dimensions case and number each have their own clearly differentiated marker. This agglutinative pattern differs radically from the fusional endings of the Indo-European language family. Fusional means, in that case, in Indo-European languages, the grammatical dimensions, case and number are fused into one single grammatical marker, which cannot be split up any further. Now, as the comparative reconstruction makes clear, the typological differences between the agglutinative Tyrsenic languages and the fusional Indo-European languages are fundamental. At first glance, the linguistic analysis seems to give a clear answer to the Tyrsenic question. Due to their agglutinative inflection, the Tyrsenic languages cannot belong to the Indo-European language family. However, and that is my point, this conclusion is premature. For typology and theories on language change now show that the gap between agglutinative and fusional languages is by no means insurmountable. Sorry. Now, why? We know in the meantime that agglutinative structures can evolve from fusional languages. Well known and well discussed is the example of the Greek of Asia Minor, some dialects of which develop an agglutinative inflection in the plural. The following paradigm comes from the dialect Ulagach. I took the word for woman, neka. Let me short present the paradigm. Nominative and singular, accusative, neka. Genitive singular, nekayu. Nominative and accusative plural, nekes. Genitive plural, nekesu. Now, in this paradigm, the original ending of the nominative singular, a, has been reanalyzed as the marker of the entire singular, the ending of the nominative plural, s, as the marker of the entire plural. Thus, a genitive singular as nekayu is reanalyzed agglutinatively as stem, nek, plus singular marker a plus case ending genitive u, and a genitive plural, nekesu, as stem, nek, plus plural marker s plus case ending genitive u. Different mechanisms lead to the emergence of agglutinative structures from fusional systems. For our purposes, the following two mechanisms are relevant. First, the internal restructuring of the paradigm, whereby usually by reanalysis, more fine boundaries are newly determined. This mechanism was effective, for example, in the Greek dialects of Asia Minor, just mentioned. And second, the integration of external, mostly collective formations into the plural paradigm. This mechanism was effective, for example, in modern Armenian, where the agglutinative plural element er goes back to old collectives. For example, in Armenian, nominative singular ask, plural asgar people, genitive dative singular asgi, plural asgari, ablative askis, plural askerich, and so on. These insights affect the Tyrsenic question as follows. The agglutinative inflection of Etruscan and its relatives cannot be taken as definitive argument against a relationship with the Indo-European language family. After all, a fusional type like Indo-European can develop agglutinative structure. Thus, and I stress at least theoretically, the Tyrsenic nominal inflection could continue an Indo-European base. In fact, arguments for a secondary development of agglutinative patterns can be found in the Tyrsenic languages and especially in Etruscan. The development seems to have started from ancient collective formation, as is the case in Armenian, mentioned above. The two essentials argument are, first, plural class 2 inanimates of Etruscan on qua seems to have synchronically the grammatical status of a collective noun, for plural nouns on qua can be congruent with a number word in the singular. And second, the inflection of Etruscan is not consistently agglutinative. There are occasional divergences between singular and plural in the case ending. For example, genitive singular avils, year, but genitive plural avil qua l, avil qual, instead of avil qua s, avil quas, as would be expected if the paradigm was consistently agglutinative. It is thus reasonable to assume that the plural morphemes in the Etruscan and consequently whole Tyrsenic derive from nominal collective suffixes. Therefore, in an early phase, Tyrsenic may well have represented a fusional language type such as Indo-European. Now, let me come to a summary. The Tyrsenic nominal system differs typologically from the Indo-European due to its agglutinative structures. But this does not exclude that it could have originated from an Indo-European ancestor. Of course, and that's important, I do not claim that Etruscans and their relatives are Indo-European. I only want to illustrate why linguistics has not yet finally elucidated the origin of the Tyrsenic languages. A last short remark, like linguistics, other disciplines do not provide a clear answer to the question of the origin of the Etruscans and their relatives. To give just one example, like the linguistic data, the data from genetic analyses do not give a consistent picture. First, the Tuscan gene pool reveals component in the MT DNA, which probably points to migration of population groups from Asia Minor. However, opinions diverge as to when the mixture of Anatolian MT DNA occurred. Estimates range from Neolithic times to the late Bronze Age from 1100 before Christ, BCE. And if I rightly understood Cosimo Post, he confirmed the late date of a mixture, of adventure of Anatolian DNA to Italy. And second, the Etruscan population does not differ significantly from the Latin population in the first millennium, but the further we look north, and thus into the Rhaetic language area, the more the picture changes, because ancient DNA analyzed in samples from the Trentino shows a certain proximity to Central or Western European Yamnaya populations of the Bronze Age. And this, as it seems, was also confirmed today by Cosimo Post and his actual results. So this Yamnaya DNA and steppe origin DNA in the Tyrsenic gene pool. Now, can it be concluded that the Tyrsenian migrated from the north and have an Indo-European Yamnaya background, but not an Anatolian Indo-European background? Or that there are autochthonous remnants of the Neolithic population of the Alpine region? Now, the linguistic data leave all possibilities open and thus confirm the title of my presentation. An answer to the Tyrsenic question is not to be expected any soon. Thanks for all your attention.
Thank you very much, Ivo. So a lot of stuff for discussion in the afternoon. but the question of the alternating Indo-European, alternating flexional or agglutinating character of the languages is a very relevant topic that we have to face. If I understand well, you suppose that a language can have developed from inflectional to agglutinating and vice versa. So it's not only one direction.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the path of language change or grammaticalization can go in both directions. And
yes. And this is an important remark. Okay. Ignazi would like to ask some question, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this presentation. I agree in general with the presentation. Only three brief remarks on very concrete questions. In your slide about the forms of pertinentive, nominative, etc. in these languages, in these Tyrsenic languages, we have no form for the previous one, I think. In Lemnian, we do have a pertinative one. We have holaiesi.
Yeah.
Holaiesi fociasale.
Yes.
Holaiesi
from Ephes,
is a Lemnian form of the pertinentive one. This is the first remark. The second one is in the case of the reconstruction of ale from ally. This is a typical reconstruction also by Rix, but there is a problem. I think sometimes or often overlooked is the fact that in the Lemnian still we have ao mai shiwai with diphthongs without monophthongation, and this is a problem because it is an inconsistency in the development of monophthongation in these languages. This is a very interesting question. I don't know if really this ale comes from ally. This is not clear for me. And the final remark is about awils. There is an alternative interpretation as an ablative, not as an genitive in the typical formulas formulae in Etruscan. We can imagine that this formula for the years perhaps is in ablative, not in nominative. This is a possibility. Only these points. I have some other questions, but perhaps better for the afternoon discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. You're completely right. Now we had 12 minutes for the talk, yes, you have to simplify some things. Holaiesi, sure. We have Heiner Eichner also listening. We have to discuss about it. Perhaps we have even traces of a plural in Rhaetic.
Yes,
it has to be discussed. Concerning the diphthongs. Sure. As you know, writing of diphthongs can differ, so monophthongation processes can always occur. And the third point, yeah, sure, all awils is controversial. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
We have other two questions from Gianfranco Chiai. The first one, please, Gianfranco.
Yes, thank you very much for your, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for your paper. I have a question regarding this Cappadocian dialect. What kind of evidence do you have for this Greek dialect? Inscription?
Yes, text samples.
Oh, okay. From which time? Hellenistic time?
Yeah, there are some grammars. But the situation is much more complicated than that because you have dialects which show literary patterns. You have dialects which show it not or half. It's very, very difficult. And you have a strong influence from Turkish and in
Turkish. Okay.
It's always given as one of the motives for this typological change.
Okay, thank you very much.
And Cosimo Post would like to ask a question. Cosimo, please.
Yeah, also a question for the last presenter, Ivo Einal. So I would like to ask you quickly, if you can go to the next slides, maybe just to understand your, no, maybe it's before, sorry. No, then it's after. It's
Then
basically
it's
when,
later. Yes.
when you actually contextualize exactly number six, slide number 6. Just to understand your standing point, in the middle point you write potentially because of the inflection, Tyrsenic language do not belong to Indo-European language family, and then you say therefore an origin of the Etruscans and their relatives from Anatolia seems questionable.
No, I told at first glance, you know, from linguistic point of view.
No, sorry, just let me finish the question, just to understand your standing point. So if it would not be an Indo-European language, let's assume it's not, why would that question the Anatolian origin?
No.
You understand my point? You understand my question?
I see the point. To repeat the point.
Yes.
In linguistics, you have this clear gap, typological gap between agglutinative systems as Tyrsenic and fusional languages, Indo-European. And if you would ask a linguist about about the Tyrsenic question, he or she would say it's not possible that we have a common origin because typologically the two language family are completely different. But as can be shown, that's not true. So the language change mechanism I showed make it possible that Tyrsenic languages, or the Tyrsenic language family could have been a fusional language family and could have been also Indo-European, perhaps. You know, there's a completely other question. And that was my point. Due to the Anatolian relatives, there are two theories. One theory is, yes, Etruscans and Tyrsenians come from Anatolia. They are Indo-Europeans, relatives to Lydians, or they come from Anatolia, but they are not Indo-Europeans.
Okay, okay.
Language is relative, for example, or near to Haitian or some other non-Indo-European languages.
Okay, thank you for your clarification.
That's the, yeah.
Yeah, I was not expecting this the two options, both. So coming from Anatolia could be both Indo-European, not Indo-European.
Taking serious your results, I have to say that the Anatolian solution is no more attractive or is no more plausible, independent of Indo-European or not Indo-European, because the admixture, genetic admixture seems to have happened, and I hope you confirmed that, and I understand you right, in the first millennium, or at the end of the Bronze Age, beginning of Iron Age.
Yes, I think it's a good summary. We can discuss later why we don't see recent Anatolian ancestry, but overall, I mean, we converge with the idea. Yeah.
All right.
Yes, I remember that we have still 4 contributions up to the end of the anti-meridian session. Ignacio Javier, do you have another question?
No, it is only this point of differentiating between Anatolian as linguistic concept, Anatolian as geographic point. This one, this question, but Ivo has clarified very, very well. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So the next speech is from Paolo Puccetti, but Paolo Puccetti is right now involved in another meeting in Convegno di Taranto, and he has a very bad connectivity. So I will read and show the slides of the text about his, just a moment. Yes, it is, and I share the screen. Okay. So, sorry. Remarks on some Etrusco-Italic shared linguistic futures. The theme of the relations between Etruscans and Italics lies at the heart of the linguistic prehistory events in Italy in the world. This issue has long been the focus of attention of linguistics and other disciplines, particularly history and archaeology, which have given conflicting answers. Moreover, the topic has been addressed from different viewpoints and objectives. On the one hand, that of the Etruscan origin, and as such, connected with the debate opposing autochthonous and allogenic origin of the Etruscan. On the other hand, the Indo-Europeization of Italy has two poles of reference: the relationship between the different strata or streams of Indo-European languages, and the relationship between the streams and the non-Indo-European components, among which the Etruscan bloc plays the primary role. During the 20th century, comparative historical linguistics reflected at length on these central themes and arrived at divergent conclusions, resulting from different methodological approaches and preconceptions or preconceived ideas that traced the research paths. Among them, we recall just two main factors. First of all, from the Etruscan perspective, the idea that Etruscan formed the visible part of an almost completely submerged iceberg of languages spread throughout the Mediterranean area that were labeled Mediterranean substrata. Most of them were merely reconstructed based on indirect clues, so that they were nothing else than ghost languages. And secondly, from the Italic perspective, relations among the Indo-European languages were generally conceived in terms of stratification, Schichten. Such a view necessarily implied the view of a multiplicity of invasions. In other words, different waves of communities speaking Indo-European languages that arrived in Italy from different regions of the continental area. According to this view, the multiple waves should have been responsible for an original differentiation of the languages before their spread in the Italian peninsula. In contrast, a different view traced back the differentiation among the languages of the Italic group after their arrival in Italy. Moreover, the invasionist perspective distinguished the perception of the Indo-Europeization in the Mediterranean regions, especially the Iberian, Italian, and Hellenic peninsulas, from their counterparts in Central and Northern Europe. Actually, in continental Europe, evidence for ancient non-Indo-European languages is very scanty, without any comparison with the Mediterranean area. In addition, the non-Indo-European languages such as Iberian in the Western Mediterranean and Etruscan in Italy are featured by an earlier and deeper literacy than the neighboring Indo-European languages. Notoriously, the Etruscan language shares with the Indo-European languages some affinities, particularly in morphology, that repeatedly underwent different evaluations. Not rarely, completely fanciful conclusions are drawn either toward the kinship with historical languages or toward reconstructive proposals of meta-historical nature, such as the labels Indo-Germanoid, formulated by Kretschmer, and the Peri-Indo-European, formulated by Devoto. In the modern approaches, the comparative pathways of the Etruscan language are twofold. On the one hand, the wide-ranging comparison with Indo-European languages far away from Italy, particularly the Middle Eastern ones, among which the Anatolian and Caucasian area represented the main focus of the research. This area was also considered an exemplary case study in that genetically isolated languages coexisted with the most archaic groups of Indo-European languages, such as Hittite, also interesting from a typological viewpoint. On the other hand, the narrow-ranging comparison with languages of the Indo-European branch of Italy. The latter approach is undoubtedly the most promising and historically concrete field, as it involves chronologically closer stages of prehistory. In this case, the crucial problem is primarily to distinguish what is prior or subsequent to the threshold of the earliest written documents, that is the beginning of the history, properly said. The Italian perspective implies to frame the question to what extent the linguistic convergences between Etruscan and other Italic languages are old. Undoubtedly, since its earliest documents, Etruscan present striking features, especially morphology, that is most relevant to the linguistic affinities with the core group of the Italic branch of the Indo-European, namely Latin Faliscan and the Sabellian languages. Those affinities are historically connected to compactness of the geographical area, gravitating around the basin of the river Tiberis and the cohesiveness of the organization of settlements, societies, and administrative institutions. Those convergence process between Etruscan and both Latin and Sabellic languages has been explained following two methodological approaches. On the one hand, the linguistic league, Sprachbund, inspired by the Balkan languages. On the other hand, the pattern of Quiné, developed within dialectology. Both have in common, even though to a different extent, to take into account the interaction between linguistic and cultural historical factors. And the pattern of Quiné, developed within dialectology. Both have in common, even though to a different extent, to take into interaction between linguistic and cultural historical factors. Can you mute your microphone, please? And the pattern of Quiné, developed within dialectology. Both have in common, even though I don't know from where it comes. Can you mute your microphone, please? And the pattern. Okay. So, sorry for the. Okay. After a long time span in which the debate on the relationship between Etruscan and the other languages of ancient Italy was sterile and unproductive, important discoveries during recent decades enabled to pose the problem on new bases. On the Sabellian and Latin side, significant epigraphic novelties dating back to stages older than those previously known allow for a closer comparison with the data of Etruscan. On the Etruscan side, progresses in the language decipherment, mostly due to both combinatorial analysis of text and typological approaches, gave more decisive contributions to the comparative historical approaches, which allowed to put some bricks in the foundation of a historical grammar of the language, as Rijks hoped for. More precisely, important epigraphic novelties coming from Rhaetian, which have stimulated philologically and epigraphically reliable edition of the corpus, and from the non-Greek epigraphy of Lemnos, have marked an unexpected advancement in historical perspective that allow Etruscan to live the condition of total isolation. Earlier than few decades, the linguistic approaches to Etruscan intermingled with the debate on the Etruscan origin according to the ancient sources seem to have condemned this language to be completely isolated among the world languages. However, the closest affinities has brought to a certain the kinship between Etruscan and Rhaetian have arisen new problems concerning the divergences between these languages, concerning the convergences with the Italic languages shared only by Etruscan. Scrutinizes convergences and divergences unavoidably implies to define the chronological stages and historical processes of their reciprocal balance. The most relevant facts of convergence, convergence concern phonology and morphology in their reciprocal interaction that generally form part of each language. Paradoxically, the earliest convergences between Etruscan and the Italic branch of the Indo-European seems to affect the morphophonological aspects than the lexical ones, concretely in loanwords. Concerning the nominal morphology, Etruscan is extraordinarily more receptive than both Indo-European languages and Rhaetic one, with respect to foreign elements. Considering that integration of foreign morphological items within a language structures requires a larger time span than lexical borrowings, we may wonder when the interference phenomena at issue should be traced back. Probably they date back to pre-documentary times. We exemplify two most relevant facts that signal relationships of Etruscan with the neighboring Indo-European languages and future geographical varieties of Etruscan itself, that are the morphemes for making derivatives in personal names. They are respectively ye, rendering the Indo-European io, that in this specific function is typical of both Latin and Sabellian languages, and alo, shared by Etruscans and Celtic of northern Italy. The onomastic use of those suffixes clearly indicates the specific sociocultural context in which the morphological borrowing took place. Personal names are also the context in which the gender motion to distinguish sex of people is implemented in Etruscan. Notoriously, Etruscan does not distinguish the grammatical gender, so that the morphological distinction between male and female sex is clearly an innovation strictly connected to personal names and to the organization of society. The morpheme used for this purpose is E, which is added to the male name, consistently with the agglutinative principle, for example, l'art, l'arti, marche, marchei, even if not politically correct from a modern point of view. The innovative character of Etruscan, differently from Rhaetian with respect to the motion of the feminine impersonal nouns, raises the question of the origin of this morpheme and consequently the parts of its integration in the Etruscan morphology. As already said, the distribution of this morpheme in Etruscan differentiates from the inflectional typology of the Indo-European languages, as shown by all the Indian pair deva, devi. Nevertheless, the expression of motion in Indo-European languages is a complicated topic, which is widely debated both as a general principle in a reconstructive perspective and a specific implementation in each individual language. If the Etruscan morpheme arises from interference with the Indo-European languages, the most ideal candidate is the Italic branch. In this case, two possible origins have been evoked. On the one hand, the genitive, Latin and Faliscan E of the O stems, and on the other hand, the morpheme ya, ye, as the feminine counterpart of yo. A reciprocal relation of E and ya in both form and function as possession mark cannot be even excluded. In this perspective, the problem concerns the Italic phase, given that it involves and the debated issue of the origin or the diffusion of the genitive in E, which occurs only in the recent phase of both Latin and Faliscan. In contrast, this morpheme never appears in the Sabellian languages, which seem to have innovated by an analogical extension of the ending of the consonant stems. A further key point of the convergence between the Etruscan and Indo-European of Italy, probably dating back to the pre-documentary period, concerns the morphophonological structures as a consequence of accent changes. The Etruscan language displays, in a more conspicuous way than the remains of the Italic languages, the weakening of the middle syllables that precedes the vowel fall. Based on this criterion, the archaic phase is generally distinguished from the recent one. Latin and Sabellian parallels of this phenomenon match the features of areal convergence. However, some occurrences in archaic varieties of the Sabellian languages suggest to date back to a period prior to his appearance in the written record since early 5th century BC. In this perspective, sociolinguistic factors could have been responsible for fixing the new phonological status in the written language. In addition, archaic documents of the Sabellian languages show a significant tendency to reduce the phonetic load of the final syllables of each word. Concretely, vowel variation in both quantity and quality, together with diphthong reduction point to a weakening of the final syllables that under certain conditions seems to be more impressive than that of the middle ones. This phenomenon has unavoidable repercussions on morphology, is proven by the nominal inflection. The most striking impact concerns the nominative case of O stems, featured by the syncope of the O vowel, whose appearance dates back to the earliest documentary threshold, for example, setums from septumo. As a result, the formal distinction between vowel and consonant inflection in the nominative and for analogical reasons in the genitive case go through lost. The most important repercussion of this fact is a convergence with languages of agglutinating typology like Etruscan. On its part, the Etruscan language presents some reflexes of morphological borrowings from the Sabellian languages, excluding Latin, such as the morpheme ns arising from nos, observed in god names, netuns, selvans. We may also wonder whether the Etruscan morpheme, ye, borrowed from an Indo-European yo, mirrors the tendency towards the weakening of the final syllables, typical of the Sabellic languages. If so, it could be an import clue from the Sabellian origin of the Etruscan morpheme. The latest point. All those features of the Etruscan morphology reveal that interference and convergence processes with the Italic languages took place prior to the threshold of the alphabetic writing, given that they appear to be already rooted since the earliest written records. On the other hand, both instances of morphological facts just mentioned demonstrate the inadequateness of the generic term Italic for labeling the impact of an Indo-European branch of the Italian peninsula on Etruscan morphology. As a matter of fact, the morpheme of gender motion excludes the Sabellian group, if we assume an origin from the E morpheme of the Latin genitive. Inversely, the weakening and disappearance of the vowel in nominative ending seems to exclude Latin, at least from the early stages of its history. In conclusion, history and prehistory of the relations between Etruscan and the Indo-European of Italy deserve to be written, or better to say, to be rewritten on a new basis. To be sure, recent advancement in deciphering of Etruscan texts and above all, the striking affinities with Rhaetic and Lemnian had important repercussions on the knowledge not only of Etruscan itself, but also of the Indo-European languages of the Italian peninsula. That's all. I interrupt the condivision. Unfortunately, you can't ask questions for this because contribution because Paolo Puccetti is not here. But from a linguistic point of view, we can discuss these elements in the later with other linguists, also with the contribution of other linguists in the round table in the afternoon. So the next contributions of the AM session is sorry. Is Gus Cronin and Andrew Wigman, Fish in a Net, Finding Etruscan in Larger Corpora. Please.
Yeah, thank you, dear organizers, for inviting us. We're really honored to be here. And Andrew will present our presentation on behalf of both of us. So I will give the floor to him.
Great. Let's see. I just have to share the screen. Is that working so far?
Yes, is everything fine?
Excellent. Great. Yeah, hello, I'm Andrew Wigman, and on behalf of myself and Gus Cronin, I'll be presenting Fish in a Net, Finding Etruscan in Larger Corpora. So the research questions we'd like to address today are: what was the nature and time depth of Latin Etruscan linguistic contact? And what could this tell us about the origin of Etruscan? So first, I think it's good to start with a map of our languages of interest for the conference, or for the roundtable today, Rhaetic, of course, and also Etruscan. These are sites where inscriptions have been found, and the black dots are the earliest Latino-Faliscan inscriptional sites. So first, to talk about contact nature, we know that historical sources show that speakers of Latin and Etruscan were in extremely close contact. And into the Roman Republic, Etruscan religious concepts called the Etrusca disciplina were highly valued. But what sorts of semantic categories do the most certain Etruscan loans fall into? In order to talk about this, I think it would be useful to mention how we can see that Latin has borrowed an Etruscan word. So the most secure cases are what we call Etruscan mediation. So for example, Greek names that underwent characteristic Etruscan changes before entering Latin. And these changes include devoicing, because Etruscan did not have phonemic voicing. The alternation of O and U, as we've seen, Etruscan only had U and was perhaps between Latin O and U in terms of pronunciation. And syncope and anaptixis. The anaptixis shows up sometimes described as vowel harmonic, but it's almost always A or E. And this happens differently than Latin. So some examples are the Greek name Ganymedes, which has entered Etruscan with devoicing and syncope as katmite, and that's the source of Latin katamitus. We know it didn't come directly from the Greek. And also Heracles entered Etruscan as Hercle and was borrowed by Latin as Hercle, with the variant that we know as Hercules as well. Skip that one for now. There are also cases where Etruscan mediation is suspected, but we don't necessarily have the Etruscan word attested. So for example, Greek gnoma shows up in Latin as groma or gruma, so OU vacillation, also kruma. And this isn't the way that Latin should borrow the Greek word, but rather looks like very Etruscoid features. Greek spuris, through the accusative spurida, entered Latin as sporta, and we have an Etruscan word spurta, but we're not really sure what it means, but that could be the source form. As well as Latin persona, which most likely is borrowed indirectly from Greek prosopon. Perhaps through this form in Etruscan we have persu. But we have to be careful because sometimes the Etruscan form does show up and it's not the source of the Latin. For example, Latin aesculapius is borrowed from Greek asclepios, but not due to Etruscan mediation because the form is esplaque, which is clearly not the source of Latin. And for example, Latin ulixes from Greek odysseus, but not through Etruscan utuste or utste. So we just have to be careful sometimes. There are also plenty of words that we know must be just of plain Etruscan origin in Latin, and it's often proposed as the source of Latin words without etymologies. The most straightforward cases involve Etruscan words of known meaning that are attested, or cases where it is claimed by an ancient author that a Latin word is of Etruscan origin. So for example, santerna, which we will also see has some very interesting morphology, meaning borax from gold smelting, is convincingly sourced from Etruscan zamati, gold. And there are also several cases where ancient authors tell us that a Latin word is of Etruscan origin. Especially Varro seems to be very trustworthy. He's early enough and he would have had access to sources that no longer exist, including potentially speakers of Etruscan. Otherwise, we have to look for Etruscoid morphology. So things that can be explained from an Etruscan perspective that are difficult to find an origin for within inherited Latin material. And one of the best examples of this is the urna suffix. It occurs in many Etruscan personal names like Maxterna, Tucerna, Velturna. And there's a case in which Latin cisterna is very clearly sourced from Greek kiste, but there's no reason or there's no native way to get this erna suffix added to the Latin. It's quite likely that it was borrowed through Etruscan. And therefore, there are several Latin words in erna that lack an Indo-European etymology, such as alaternus, and as we've seen, santerna, and these could quite likely be of Etruscan origin, thanks to the morphology that we see. So, looking through some of the literature that took as its purpose finding Etruscan words in Latin, I think I picked a good representative sample. There are, of course, plenty more that have been suggested. But if we look at the semantic domains of these Etruscan words in Latin, we see a wide range of semantic domains. So some political, especially religious, as we expected from the historical record, botanical, architectural, cultural. If we think of this in terms of an adstrate situation, there are some substrate looking things, but there are definitely a lot of superstrate looking loans, just a very wide semantic range. What can we say about the contact time depth? Well, we also know historical sources show that the Latin and Etruscan were in prolonged contact, and they were close enough in contact that they underwent similar aerial changes. So when we get the first Etruscan and Latin inscriptions in the 7th century, and by the end of the 7th century, Etruscan starts to show vowel weakening. By 500 BC, Latin then also shows vowel weakening and syncope, and by 470, the Etruscan inscriptions attest to syncope and anaptixis. And this has been taken to suggest widespread, also including the Sabellic languages, shift to an initial accent. And I think that in order for something this drastic to occur in all of these languages, they must have been in close contact by 600 BCE, which is when the inscriptions start to show these changes. So at least from this data, we can say they're in contact by 600 BCE, close contact. So now we should take a look at the origins debate, which is a topic that's come up a lot and will come up a lot more, I'm sure. We have, for example, based on the reports of Herodotus in the 5th century, that the Etruscans came from the east. And this falls into two camps, whether this came in 800 BCE or 1200 BCE. Then there's also, based on the conflicting report of Dionysius of Halicarnassus, that the Etruscans were autochthonous. And then we have to explain the position of Lemnian when that split. And so there's a more recent and a more ancient hypothesis. So let's look at some of the evidence for both of these positions. In terms of the Anatolian hypotheses, the earlier hypothesis in the literature was that perhaps Etruscans arrived in 800 BC from Anatolia at the change from the Proto-Villanovan to the Villanovan cultures. But today it seems that this is without a strong archaeological basis, and that the changes that occur between these cultures are less of an invasion and more the uptake of closer contacts with Mediterranean trade partners. And also, as we've seen in Cosimo Post's study, the genetic evidence that shows these samples from 800 BC were already admixed with steppe ancestry homogeneously seems to definitely preclude this situation. So what if we move the date back to 1200 BCE and say Etruscan arrived from Anatolia after the fall of the Bronze Age, as has been championed recently by Bakis and Klughorst? I think that much of the evidence is actually circumstantial or can go both ways. So for example, it's based on Herodotus's report that the Etruscans, well, the Tyrsenians left from Lydia after a long famine, and there's no indications that this is historical fact. The Lemnian inscriptions, of course, are in the area of Anatolia, but they could represent a movement either way. The Sea Peoples include what has been interpreted as the Tyrsenioi and also the Lycians, which is an Anatolian group, but they also include what has been interpreted as other Mediterranean populations, such as the Achaeans, the Sardinians, and the Sicilians. So it's not specifically an Anatolian cluster. And it's been remarked that the river Umbro flows through Etruscan territory, but we can't exclude that with the flourishing of Etruscan peoples and culture, that they would have conquered territory. There are also some linguistic links that have been proposed between Etruscan and Anatolian, but I find them by and large unconvincing. Perhaps the Etruscan name, and we know the Etruscan hero Tarchon, it's been suggested that this is related to Tarchuntas, but There's also the idea that this mat word, which we're not sure exactly what it means, but it's been potentially interpreted as meaning something like honeyed wine. And if indeed it does mean that, the vocalism is closer to the Anatolian word for honey or mead rather than Greek, but its meaning is insecure as it is. There's potentially a match between Tamera, type of official, and Hittite Damara, female functionary, which could be due, of course, to chance or to cultural exchange. An Etruscan sakni, which is some type of religious vocabulary, does look a bit like Hittite shakalish, right? But I think it looks also extremely close to Latin, the root in Latin sacer, holy. So I think that's a much better explanation. In terms of the autochthonous hypothesis, which says that Etruscan represents a pre-Indo-European language of Italy, I think in this case there is what we can consider positive evidence that given to us by Oettinger and De Simone and Marchesini, that it seems very likely that Rhaetic split first, and Etruscan and Rhaetic are or were still spoken in Italy. Thus the split most likely happened in Italy. And so I think overall, given the weakness of the other hypothesis, this is the stronger hypothesis. And now what remains to be seen is the position of Lemnian when it split. So for example, De Simone said that Lemnian represents a trade colony of Etruria founded in 700 BCE. Melanie Maltzahn showed that Lemnian acquired its alphabet independently of Etruscan, which led Oettinger to criticize 700 BC as being too late. Although Etruscan and Lemnian are very close linguistically, he says Lemnian probably split in 1200 BC and really thought it should be connected to the migrations of the Sea peoples. However, the colonization of Lemnos need only have occurred in the pre-literate era, therefore prior to 700 BCE. And therefore, I consider something more like what Drews believes to be the most accurate. Etruscan and Lemnian are so similar, it's unlikely that they'd been separate for a full 600 years on basically opposite sides of the Mediterranean. So in conclusion, especially with the genetic data that Oettinger was looking forward to in 2010, he said, "Die Zukunft wird es zeigen." I think neither the linguistic nor the archaeological evidence excludes the possibility of a long history, close contact between Latin and Etruscan. And in fact, the genetic evidence points towards a long history of close contact. And so I think the autochthonous hypothesis is supported, and that means that Etruscan would qualify as a pre-Indo-European language of Europe. This is significant because we can and should expect to find more Etruscan vocabulary hiding in the Latin words of non-Indo-European origin. We can use Latin as a net to catch Etruscan fish, if you will. And we should also potentially see links with other Mediterranean substrate words, which is the project that Hus is running, looking for the substrate languages of Europe. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, both of you, Gus and Andrew. Many hints also by this contribution to be brought in the discussion in the afternoon. Are there remarks to these questions, remarks to this contribution to the speech?
Only a very brief remark. The word Tamera has been recognized in the mid-1980s to define some kind of space, a sacred space, a precinct, a tomb. So it has nothing to do with a name of a function. It was a misleading interpretation by Olsha, so in the 1940s, 1950s. This is only, of course, a marginal remark, no more.
Thank you for that.
So I guess it is important that you entered the problem of the contact during the Sea Peoples period, and we will discuss this afternoon.
Yes. Okay. Gerard, bitte, please. Gerard, we can see you and we can hear you. Hello? Gerard? Seems not to react. Are there any other questions in the meanwhile?
No, it does.
Yes,
That's
Gerard,
okay.
we can see you. If you can activate your camera.
Yeah, but Alisa should take away her sharing.
Okay.
It's very surprising that the Greeks in Pithecusae were in this way endogamous. Because if you go to the museum in Pithecusae, you look at the parts of the costume, it seemed very much Italic. So I was always thinking about that Italic local persons were married to Greek colonials, but it's completely different.
Yeah, so this is in fact also the results that Melania Giganta has from her strontium isotope studies, that it seems there does seem to be some intermarriage between the locals and the Greeks on Pithecusae. It might be just by chance that we sampled one individual that appeared to be fully Greek. It might be a recent migrant or the offspring of recent migrants. And we're just missing the more full picture on this site.
All right, thank you very much.
Other questions? Then I would invite Gianfranco Chiai to speak about Lemnos and its cultural memories. We are going far away from the Rhaetian area.
Yes, Simona, can you hear me? Okay, I try. Can you see my presentation?
Yes. We can see it.
Okay. Thank you, Simone, for the invitation. Currently, I'm in Brandenburg, and due to the storm of yesterday, we have a very bad connection. I hope you can hear me clearly. Okay, the topic of my short lectures is Lemnos, its culture and its cultural memories. It's an overview. First of all, I will try to reconstruct the material culture of these islands according to the archaeological evidence. Then, I'm going to tell you something what a mythical tradition tell regarding the Lemnian civilization. And finally, I will try to show you how the mythical traditions confirm in some regard the archaeological evidence. Okay, let me start with the archaeological evidence. It's a geographical, you see the strategic position of Lemnos in the Aegean area. This is a map of Lemnos, and the main sites, most important places excavated by archaeologists are Merina, Ephestia, and particularly the area around the Hellenistic sanctuary called Cabirion, and not far from Ephestia, the necropolis. Finally, we can mention Paliogni, very important prehistoric settlement. Greek archaeologists, namely the Greek archaeologist Christos Boulotis, discovered in the island, the small island of Koukonisi, Mycenaean settlement. Okay, specifically, regarding the material culture, archaeologists identify two types of pottery, of ceramics. The first one is concerning the archaic time, the period between the 9th and the 6th century BC. The first category of pottery ceramics is the Anatolian grey ware. The typical pottery of this area. The second category is that of G2-3. It's a kind of subgeometric pottery, attested also in Troya, for example. And broadly speaking, this archaeological evidence make it possible to locate material, the linear material culture between Anatolians and Euboeans. Moreover, the archaeological evidence from the necropolis from Epiphysia, we have a lot of material, Corinthian ceramics, Euboean pottery, etc., testify interesting exchanges and contact with other part of the Greek world, Euboea, Corinthia, Corinth and Ionia, etc. Moreover, furthermore, we have also archaeological evidence for contact with Thracian population, with Thracian people. Contextualizing this material, we can speak of a Greek Anatolian cultural koine. This, for example, according to an old definition given by Santo Mazzarino, a very important Italian historian. It's the area of diffusion of the Anatolian Greek ware. It's the area of diffusion of this pottery called G2-3. This according to the reconstruction given by the archaeologist of the Archaeological Italian School of Athens. Some example of this pottery. You see in this image some typical Euboean pattern in the ceramic pottery produced in Lemnos. And from the necropolis of Ephesia, we have the most important material and cultural evidence. The archaeological material make possible to reconstruct the social stratification of Lemnos in archaic time. We have images also of this aristocracy. We can recognize also typical iconographic pattern we find in archaic culture of Greece. Very important is also the continuity of a kind of Aegean substrate. What the English archaeologist Irene Lemnos call miscellaneous interface. For example, in the field of the religion, we have this painted terracotta idol found in Ephesia, and that is matter of dispute among archaeologists, broadly speaking, probably in the 7th century BC. And you see in this case, this very interesting and amazing similarity to this Mycenaean idol, in this case, a Mycenaean idol from Medea. typical image of a Limnian culture, for example, the Sphinx. It is showing the participation of Lemnos to the broad cultural context of the Anatolian cultures. And in this case, we see some images of the most important local deity of Lemnos. It's a female deity. According to the literary evidence, Lemnia Theos, all the images of this great martyr of Cybele, and very interesting parallel can be found, for example, in the Phrygian territory. We have on the left a representation, a statue from Hattusha from Bogatskoi, representing the Phrygian Cybele with two corriband or two cabeo. The iconography of this statue, you can see, for example, pay attention please to Paulus, find some interesting contact point with a typical iconography of the Limnian goddess. We have, for example, a representation on a vase in the pottery of the Limnian goddess, and in front of her we can recognize the image of a musician, like in very similar to the iconography of the Phrygian goddess Cybele. Other images from Lemnos. Contextualizing the material culture of Lemnos, all these similarities with the Phrygian culture, with the Ionian culture, show that, yes, testify that the material culture of the island of Lemnos in archaic time, we're speaking of the time of the Tyrrhenian, was a kind, yes, was Anatolian, Greek Anatolian culture.
Gianfranco, I think he is frozen. Oh, that's a pity. Bad weather is influencing our conference. German weather. What do you do, Alessandro? What do you suggest?
Well, I suggest that maybe we can also interrupt and have the end of the presentation at the beginning of the afternoon if he is not able to join now.
Yes.
Yes, he did you interrupt him or did he do
No,
it?
no, I wasn't. It wasn't me. He dropped.
You closed it. He dropped
Yes.
it. I think that we can maybe take our break.
Yes.
And then we hope that he's able to present again. At the
again to end this presentation at the end, at the beginning of
maybe just going to the conclusions so that we follow because the Lemnos point is important to discuss, because as we say, so there are proposals that suggest a movement from west to east, but I was wondering what he was suggesting.
Yes, at the end.
Yeah.
I write you that he will continue in the afternoon.
Yes.
So please, let's meet here again in 1 hour or
yes, let's say 2:45.
2:45. What?
Yeah, I would
that
say
we have 1 hour and quarter.
Well, maybe you can open again at 2:30, and then we start at 40.
Yes,
10
okay.
Minutes, 10 minutes.
Okay, so thank you very much for the moment. We will see you again in 1 hour, more or less. Okay.
Thank you very much, everybody. This was great.
Thank you.